We welcome everyone to our Bible study this week, based on Nehemiah chapters 4 through 6. This comes from the Faith Connection Sunday School lesson for July 5th. Last week's lesson showed us that God works through prayer of those who are passionate. Those who are passionate about prayer, God does mighty things through. Today we want to talk a little bit in depth about how God equips believers in the face of opposition. In Nehemiah 4, 1 through 9, we read, "Now when Sanballat heard that we were building the wall, he was angry and greatly enraged, and he mocked the Jews. He said in the presence of his associates and of the army of Samaria, 'What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore things? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish it in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and burned ones at that?' Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, 'The stone wall they are building, any fox going up on it would break it down. Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn their taunt back on their own heads, and give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover their guilt, and do not let their sin be blotted out from your sight, for they have hurled insults in the face of the builders.' So we rebuilt the wall, and the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward, and that the gaps were beginning to be closed, they were very angry, and all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. So we prayed to our God and set a guard as a protection against them day and night." Nehemiah's first challenge as he was building the wall, going back to the task to rebuild the land that he had come from, came from outside the Jewish community. There's a very strong principle that those who don't understand God's work tend to throw up barriers to it. Why is that? Because God's kingdom is perceived as a threat to their kingdom. We still see that very much at work in the world today. Many don't want to hear Christian principles. They don't want to hear the truth of God because it's going to change their own personal kingdoms, the little kingdoms that they build up around themselves. The reality is, there's usually a more selfish motive for that. Tobiah and Sanballat were business leaders in the area. They feared that if the walls were rebuilt, Jerusalem would once again become a strong financial center. Needless to say, their main fear was not the theological impact, but their fear was the financial impact that the rebuilding of Jerusalem could have on them and their businesses. So they did, and this sounds so much like a modern thing today, they basically started a campaign of trash talking, for lack of a better term. They were saying they were basically trying to use materials that had been burned and damaged in the fire, insulting them by saying they weren't qualified to build the wall. They added things like, that's really an insult. If a fox, which is a relatively small animal, were to walk on the wall, it would collapse. And the sole purpose of that was to try to discourage the people, that they were wasting their time in what they were doing. They could try to rebuild the wall, but their efforts were going to fail. And they hoped that somehow they could discourage the work before it went forward. Well, this, of course, did not work, so then their next step was to form alliances with other nations to try to badmouth the kingdom of Israel, to peg them as a threat, both to their lands and to the Persian Empire, through whom most of them were experiencing a great deal of peace. It was to be any way they could to discourage the work that was going on in the temple. Nehemiah practiced an important lesson that we should always remember what our first response should be. Nehemiah's first response was always prayer. So many times in our world today, we say prayer as the last resort when we've exhausted everything else. But might I say this morning, true success comes with the project that begins with prayer. And that is one of the things that Nehemiah always did. Despite the opposition, despite what was going on, his first response was prayer. Nehemiah organized and equipped the people to fight as necessary. Now, notice he didn't organize the people first. He didn't arm the people first. He prayed first. Again, so many times we enter into the trap of, okay, God, I've got this all organized for you. Now will you bless the efforts as it goes forth? No. Nehemiah took the opposite approach. He prayed for God's guidance as he was doing the organization. He challenged the people to two things. First, they were to be vigilant in their building, and most of all, to remember the Lord, to remember why they were building. Such an important thing. You know, we do a lot of things day by day because we have to. But there are some things we do because we are commissioned to do so. And what we do for the Lord, we should be reminded. We are to remember who we're working for. Nehemiah remained committed to his purpose and relied on God's strength. And the result was the project went forward. Nehemiah knew he didn't have it in his own strength to rebuild Jerusalem. Nehemiah knew the opposition was great, but he knew that he was doing the Lord's work and nothing could stand in his way. In Nehemiah 5, verses 1 through 5, now there was a great outcry of the people and of their wives against their Jewish kin. For there were those who said, with our sons and our daughters we are many. We must get grain so that we may eat and stay alive. There were also those who said, we are having to pledge our fields, our vineyards, and our houses in order to get grain during the famine. And there were those who said, we are having to borrow money on our fields and vineyards to pay the king's tax. Now our flesh is the same as that of our kindred. Our children are the same as their children. And yet we are forcing our sons and daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters have been ravished. We are powerless, and our fields and vineyards now belong to others. Nehemiah not only had to deal with opposition coming from outside Israel, but he had to deal with some internal struggles. One of them was the wealthy were taking advantage of the poor. It went to the extent that some even had to offer their children as slaves to pay their debts and their taxes. Nehemiah knew this was not something that could be totally ignored. Nehemiah knew he had to confront the people about this problem, and he offered a rebuke. The first thing, such practices tarnish God's nature. If you go all the way back to the time of the Exodus, even back to Abraham, the purpose of the nation of Israel was so that they could be a nation of priests, which would show the glory of God, the righteousness and holiness of God to all the world. So they would recognize him as the one true and loving God in all the earth. And when within their own people, one was taking advantage of the other, that tarnished that image. It didn't make how the Israelites lived look attractive to those who might be observing. Therefore, Nehemiah said, this should not be. He reminded them that they were to be this example to the rest of the world, and part of that meant being to care for one another's needs. Now, that doesn't mean we have the responsibility to, enable someone to be lazy and not do their share. But by the same token, we shouldn't have any reason to put down someone. I saw one of the TV court cases the other day, and someone had taken out a loan at 99% interest. That shouldn't happen among God's people. That is not the example that we want to show. The people responded to Nehemiah when it was pointed out what they were doing. They responded positively with generosity and grace. And that was demonstrated as a witness to those who were watching what was going on among the people of Israel. It made a remarkable change. In Nehemiah chapter 6, verses 14 to 16, when Tobiah and Sanballat, oh my God, according to these things that they did, and also the prophetess Noadiah, and the rest of the prophets who wanted to make me afraid, so the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month of Elul in 52 days. And when our enemies heard of it, all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem. For they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. The wall was completed. Despite all the opposition from within and without, nothing could try to defeat what was accomplished. The enemies of Israel tried to attack the leaders through false accusations by accusing that they were trying to rebel against the king of Persia. Everything else they had tried to block this had failed, so they'd try one more thing. Well, Nehemiah remained steady and depended on the Lord's help to get through the situation. He didn't try to do things his own way. He just trusted God each step of the way. And, yes, the wall was completed. But this is such a critical point here. The wall was completed in only 52 days. So the critics had to admit that it was the power of God that brought it to completion and not man's own abilities. They knew very well that the people of Israel, with the equipment they had, with the materials they had, that wall should have been something that never took place. But in less than 2 months, this great wall around the city of Jerusalem was rebuilt. And it was such a witness that all the other nations watching, no matter what deity they served, they knew that it was the power of God that had brought this to pass. Just a couple of questions that we want to consider today before we close. What challenges from outside the community of faith place obstacles in the path of building God's kingdom? We know that in our culture today, the world is bringing new criticisms on the church. Unfortunately, the church sometimes has asked for some of this criticism, but the bottom line is we must be faithful and true to to what God has called us to do, and must always be showing forth his love and grace to a world that so desperately needs it. If we fail in sharing the love and grace, they are going to assume that everything else we have to say is false and wrong. So therefore, we must be faithful in our witness, in caring for one another and showing love to the world around us, who so desperately needs to know who Jesus is. And by the way, there's so much negative publicity against the church today. The only way that they will really see him work is to see the love of God manifested in the hearts and lives of Jesus' followers. Yes, there too are challenges from inside the community of faith. You know, there are a lot of things, just like in Israel, that can hinder the work within the kingdom of God. One of the obstacles I see, we can let traditions be our God. Now, I personally like some traditions. Most of us do. But we need to always ask the question, why are we doing this? And sometimes there is a good reason why we do something the way we do. Sometimes there's not. And if there isn't a reason beyond we've always done it a certain way, then perhaps we should examine that particular aspect and see if there is a better way of doing something. We have been challenged over these last few months to find many different ways of worship. But I believe the church can be stronger today than it ever was if we will just continue on his path and, most of all, meet the challenges with Nehemiah's example, which is becoming a body of prayer. Being willing to lay aside everything else to just focus on what God is telling us to do. Not to pray as a last resort, not to pray as a tradition, but to enter into his presence, to be guided day by day by the power of prayer. I believe that's the example that Nehemiah left. You see the success that came about there. I have to believe if we saw more prayer, we might see more success in our spiritual growth today. Let's bow for a moment of prayer. Precious Heavenly Father, we do thank you for this passage in Nehemiah. Sometimes we overlook some of these Old Testament nuggets, but we really see an example for growth and progress in our hearts and lives. Will you help us to bathe our hearts with prayer, to be guided by the power of prayer, to surrender our own wants and wishes, and just truly let you have your way in our hearts and lives. Your blessed holy name we do ask it. Amen.